Yes, like Sarah said, my name is Alicia, and I'm currently the New York Fellow. Very happy and grateful to be joining you all today for this conference. And then also very happy to be having this conversation with Valerie Jarrett. As you all may know, Valerie was the senior advisor to former President Barack Obama. She was also a senior distinguished fellow at the University of Chicago Law School, and most recently, an author, Finding My Path, My Journey to the West Wing and Forward. So, Valerie, very happy to be having this conversation with you. How are you doing?
I I am doing just great, all things considered, and delighted to be with you here. I enjoyed being with you guys when we were in New York, so I thought we'd do it again.
Yes, definitely. So if you guys remember, you guys may also remember Valerie was with us for Ignite Young Women Run conference in New York in February. And on that note, if it's okay with you, Valerie, I'd like to get this conversation started.
Let's go.
Okay, and as we're speaking, let us know in the chat box what resonates with you, and even think of some questions that you would want to ask. So I'd like to start with what has been the impact of systematic racism on voting, and when we think about the current events, how can we sustain this Black Lives Matter movement beyond the upcoming election?
Well, those are two big questions. So, systematic racism has had an enormous amount to do with voting, beginning with Black people not having the right to vote initially.
Yes.
And even after we got the right to vote, we still experience voter suppression to this day. And so the question becomes, what do we do to empower ourselves to
Right.
make sure that we are enforcing the laws that give us those rights? And what do we do to push back against various state houses and secretaries of state who put in place laws, policies, and practices that suppress our vote? And the good news is that there are lots of great organizations that are working on just that right now. But we also need the voices of ordinary citizens saying, we need transparency, we need to understand what our rights are, and we need to challenge these onerous laws that are being passed that make it very difficult for us to vote. So this has been a challenge that we've had with us forever, and we are going to have to really fight to make sure every vote counts, and also that we aren't disenfranchising ourselves. And so one of the reasons why I'm so happy to chair the board of When We All Vote, the not-for-profit organization that Mrs. Obama launched a couple of years ago, is because it shouldn't be about politics. It should be about how do we change our culture to make sure that everybody gets to vote and everybody realizes their civic responsibility to vote, and that we have transparency so that the integrity of our elections are intact. And now, as for Black Lives Matter continuing, that depends on the movement. I have seen movements build to an inflection point and then peter out, and I've seen movements perpetuate themselves, and it all depends upon who is a part of that movement and how committed they are to fight the good fight. So just for historical context, I would say to you that the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, where people decided, okay, we're not going to ride the bus because, as Rosa Parks said, she was sick and tired of being sick and tired. She just was not going to get on the back of that bus. And it lasted for over a year, all the way up to the Supreme Court to determine that you couldn't force people to sit in the back of public transportation. And that requires sacrifice. And we have to be prepared for the long haul. And it isn't about one election or one issue. Being a citizen is a way of life. Mm-hmm. And so movements have to become a part of your life. And people have to make up their mind that they love this country enough to change it.
Yeah, definitely. And so there are a lot of young people, or a lot of people in general, that are watching this conference and joining us here. And then, so once they make that decision that they want to change something, how do you think they can go about mobilizing their peers, or even those who are not of voting age just yet?
Well, look, I think civics begins at a very early age. I was meeting with a group of mayors a few months ago, And the mayor of Madison, Wisconsin, makes it a point to personally go and visit every fifth grade class in her city. Why? Because she wants to talk to young people while they're still impressionable about the importance of voting. So when they come of age, it's already a part of the culture. It's a given. It's an expected. I know in my family, I went to the polls with my parents when I was a little kid. And I'd be so excited on election day to get to go into the voting booth with them, and they would show me what they were doing. And so by the time it came time for my first election, I couldn't get to the polls fast enough. And unfortunately, in this climate, we are seeing a disproportionately large number of young people, particularly, who don't vote. And they shun all institutions and they don't see the relevance. And I will say the excruciating civics lesson that we've had this year with the COVID-19, and then the loss of jobs, and then the loss of our livelihood and the long-term impact that that's going to have on families, and then the racial tensions that have bubbled up, is that people really do see the correlation between government and their lives in a way that perhaps they didn't appreciate sufficiently before. And now we know. I mean, many people didn't know who their governor was. Now you know who your governor is. You know whether or not they're providing the resources you need. You know whether the federal government is stepping up to make sure you have unemployment insurance and small business loans, and the healthcare delivery system is dependent on support from the public sector. So all of these different ways in which we have experienced this 2020 should be a real wake-up call that elections have consequences and they matter, and that it's on us to do our homework and say, well, what do you care about? What are the issues that excite you? And whether it's reducing gun violence or improving relationship between police and communities of color, or climate change, or making sure that we are promoting small businesses so they can grow and be anchors in our community. Whatever the issue is that you care most about, you got to do your homework and make sure that the people who are running for office, that you understand where they stand on these issues. So movements really continue when people are invested, and I think that's what's happening. It feels different. I was alive during the civil rights movement of the 60s. This moment in time feels like it has momentum at its back, but it's up to each and every one of us to keep that going.
Yeah. And then one thing you said about being happy going to the election with your parents, like when they were going to vote, someone in the chat box mentioned the same thing, that they were so grateful for that experience, for their parents to take them to every election. So I think, like you said, seeing it firsthand and starting from a young age is going to be very important and will affect how you go into voting when you do become of age.
Exactly, Alicia. And young people, those of you who are so much a part of this Ignite effort, you can go and talk to high school or elementary school kids who aren't eligible to vote. Get them to talk to their classmates. We have to meet people where they are and build it into the culture so that when you do come of age, you're not only voting, but you are a responsible, well-informed voter. And you can begin that at any age. The earlier, the better.
Yep, definitely. And like you said, starting early, the earlier the better. Over here at Ignite, we're in the colleges, we're in the high schools, we're everywhere. We're trying to reach everybody. So I guess on that note, is there anything we can do now to stop voter suppression?
Well, we have to educate voters about what their rights are. And so, for example, I'll give you just one example. Lots of states, I won't say lots of states, several states purge their rolls, which means you got to go back and register again. And you might show up at the polls and not realize that your name had been purged. Well, you have the right to cast a provisional ballot. A lot of people don't know that. They show up and they say your name's not on the list, and you think, well, I can't vote. You can. And so we have to help educate people about what their rights are, so that then when they get to the polls, if there's a problem, they know what to do about it. There are lawyers who are out there during elections who are available to help. And so you have to advocate for yourself if you run into a problem. But today, go and make sure you're registered. Don't just presume because you were registered in the last election that you're registered again today. Help people check on their status so that you don't wait till the last minute. And then there are three other things really I'm encouraging. We need to have vote by mail. And I know there's been some pushback saying that it's fraught with corruption. That's just simply not true. The evidence doesn't bear that out. Elections people have been able to vote by mail in elections going back to the Civil War when the military has been voting by mail. There's states like Washington State that 100% of their ballots are cast by mail. We can do this. We just have to be prepared for it. We need to give the Postal Service a little bit more money so that they are able to accommodate the influx in ballots coming in. We should extend the early vote. We need your voices out there advocating for that. We all saw the lines from Wisconsin to Georgia during the primaries where people were choosing between their health and exercising their right to vote. You shouldn't have to make that choice. So we need you all to lift up your voices on these issues to make sure that our elections are fair, they are open, and they are accessible.
Yeah, and thank you for those suggestions too. And I see that we have questions starting to come in. So if you want to put right in the chat box, any questions you'd like to ask Valerie, one that we gotten is, can you speak more about your experience with When We All Vote?
Yes, so Mrs. Obama formed our organization a couple years ago, right after the last presidential race, where we were struck by the fact that 100 million eligible voters didn't vote. Mm-hmm. And that's just not acceptable. And so we decided, look, there are folks like Stacey Abrams, for example, who's focusing on voter suppression and combating states that have onerous laws on the books. And Eric Holder is working on redistricting to make sure that the laws are apportioned properly and we have appropriate representation. And we decided to take on in a nonpartisan way this culture around voting. So we formed this organization, and you can go on whenwegovote.org and sign up to be a volunteer, get involved, form a voting squad with you and your friends, tell your friends to expand it from there. I mean, the voting has to be a retail business because every vote matters. And if you want to change a culture, we can pass all the laws in the world, but if people just go, why should I vote? Then they won't do it. So we want your help to really start to talk to people about the importance of voting. And we can use, as I said earlier, the example of the last 6 months to bring home why it's so important at every level. It matters who's your mayor, who's on the city council, who's overseeing the police department, selecting the police commissioner, who are the prosecutors making decisions about what charges to bring against whom, who's in the state legislature, who's in Congress, and certainly who's the president of the United States. And so educating your friends and your colleagues, you can never begin that too early.
Yeah. So let's say that as a young person, you decide I'm ready to go and vote, and you realize there isn't a polling station. Someone asked in the comments, how can we fight against the decreasing number of polling sites?
Well, this is a challenge, and it's going to be even more of a challenge in this pandemic because people are having a hard time getting around. That's one where you have to put pressure on your local election commission. Mm-hmm. And that might mean going and showing up at a hearing and saying, look, I have to walk 2 miles to vote. That's unconscionable. That's not protecting my right to vote. And you've got to do that early where there's still a chance to influence adding precincts, locations, polling places. And some of it is, oftentimes, and I heard about this in the primaries, right, the folks that man our polling places are often elderly people who might be afraid to work during this pandemic. So maybe you should volunteer to staff up so that they don't have to close because they lack personnel. That shouldn't be an excuse for closing a polling location. But the more you push, the more likely it is to see change.
Yeah, I like that. I'm gonna take a mental note of that quote and keep that for later. So another question we got in the chat box, and definitely drop your questions in, is what is the best way to educate someone on the mail-in ballot process and getting the application mailed to you?
Well, it varies by state. Each state has different rules and regulations on mail-in ballots. So you've got to look, and you can go to the Secretary of State website in your state and find out what the procedure is. Or you can go to your local city election commission as well. It depends on jurisdictions, but the safest is the Secretary of State because that's who oversees your statewide election process. And find out what you have to do. There's some states that are mailing them out on their own. Some we're proposing mail them out with the self-addressed envelope so people don't have to pay to vote. There are other states that are not going to do it in that way. So you've got to do your homework and figure out what works in your state, and then get the word out to everybody to do it as soon as possible. One of my best friends who lives in New York temporarily votes in Georgia. That's her residency.
Mm-hmm.
And she applied for a mail-in ballot back in March, and it never came. It never came. Twice she applied for it. So you've got to stay on top of this and be an advocate and get and request it sufficiently in advance that if we do have problems with the mail, that you're way out ahead of the pack. So this is something you should be doing as soon as it's possible in your state. Send it in as early as you can to make sure your vote counts.
Got it. Definitely. And anyone watching us, you can go to ignitenational.org to get your state specific voting plan. And so someone asked, if it's not about voting, how do we go about reporting other problems we see in our community, in our areas?
Well, it depends on what the problem is. So, if you see something that is troubling to you, the first line of defense could be your local city hall. I mean, they have non-emergency numbers all over the country. I know in Chicago it's 311 and save 911 for a real emergency so that you're not taking resources away from somebody who's really in trouble. So it depends upon what the issue is. And you can go on the websites of your local jurisdiction, and oftentimes they have it broken down by agency. So if you are having problems getting a permit, go to this place. If you're having problems with people who are throwing garbage on your property, go to this place. If you have it needs to be trimmed, you go to this place. It all kind of depends upon what you have to do.
Mm-hmm. So what?
The internet isn't working. Now you can still hear me, can't you?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So is there any other suggestion, I guess, that would make the process easier, that would allow more people to vote?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of your question. What did you say?
Anything else that would make the registration process easier, allow more people to vote?
Well, I think we should all be able to register online, right? That's the simplest thing. So we don't have to go down to local, clerk's office to register to vote. I think we should be the early vote we already talked about, voting online, not voting online, registering online, expanding the early vote. Those are the easiest things, I think, that make it less cumbersome for people to vote. There's some people who need help getting to the polls, so volunteer to drive people to the polls if it's safe to do that when we have a pandemic. There are all kinds of ways that volunteers can get involved to try to make it a little bit easier. But I would also make this point. Even if it's hard, even if you have to stand in a long line, socially distancing yourself, it's worth it. Put pressure on your employers to offer time off with pay to vote. That's something that I've been talking to business leaders about recently. Is that if people can't afford to get docked for their time to vote on a Tuesday and they don't have an early vote, well, then offer them to go for 4 hours or the day, whatever you can afford, so that they can vote. And that's something that put pressure on your employers, and they're likely in this moment to give because they recognize how important it is that people vote in every election.
Yeah, and this election is going to be. It's going to be important. Is there anything you'd like to say to anyone from the states whose primaries are, like New York, whose primaries are tomorrow, for example?
Show up. Show up, go early so that you can try to avoid the lines if possible. Wear a mask. In New York, everybody's wearing a mask if you're out in public and you can't stay 6 feet away. Try to stay 6 feet away from everybody, and be prepared that it might be a long line, but it's worth it. I just did a call with a group who are helping sponsor a movie about the life of I just lost John Lewis. My goodness. It's like, I've done so many Zooms today. I couldn't remember which one I was talking about. So there's a new movie coming out about the life of John Lewis. And, just think about the sacrifices he made, walking across that Edmund Pettus Bridge, getting beat up and bloodied, going back again. People made a lot of sacrifices for us to have the right to vote. We're coming up on this summer, the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment that gave white women the right to vote. And the people who participated in hunger strikes and demonstrations and were sent to jail and whose husbands disowned them to fight for that right to vote from the time of the petition of universal suffrage in 1866 to the time the amendment was finally adopted in 1920. Well,
Mm-hmm.
you know what? A lot of the people who started out on that journey didn't live to see us cross the finish line, but their work was important. It
Yeah.
mattered. And so that's part of activism, is recognizing, you might not have the good fortune of the thunderbolt on your watch, but you lay the foundation for it to come in time ahead. And the more you push, the more likely it is to happen while you're still on duty.
Yeah. And on that activism note, someone in the chat box thanked you for your continued leadership and activism for civic engagement. And then we have another question. A number of states are making it extremely difficult to secure an absentee ballot. And given what has happened in Wisconsin and in the Georgia primaries, it seems like young people are not trusting the system and will want to vote in person anyway. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, look, it's tough because I do think we have to, in the first instance, put pressure on the secretaries of state to get the vote by mail right.
Mm-hmm.
But I understand, particularly after we saw the debacle in Georgia. I saw Stacey Abrams do an interview a few days ago, and she was another one who requested her absentee ballot and never came, and she had to go down and vote in person. Same thing with Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, the mayor of Atlanta. She never got hers either, had to go down and vote in person. So I think you want to keep your options open, request
Mm-hmm.
it by mail. If it comes, send it in, and if you get it in ahead of time, it will be counted. But if you don't get it, then you better make sure you reserve some time to go vote. And if you can vote early rather than on election day, please do so.
Yeah, and there are some comments about people waiting, but still standing in line, making sure that they were able to get their vote out, and even making sure that there is social distancing as they see other people or not. Anything they
Yeah, that's
to get
exactly right. Don't follow the lead here. Do what you know is right.
right. Oh, and then again, if anyone is looking for state specific voting plans, we have that at ignitenational.org/vote 2020. And Valerie, as we reach to, I guess, the end of our chat, do you have any final words, or what is your call to action for the hundreds of people who are joining us on this conference?
Well, I guess I would say this to you when I was your age, is that you have to make up your mind that you're going to lead a purposeful life. And that's totally within your control. You can't always control what happens to you. You can control what you do and what you do about the circumstances that you're in. And so we hunger in our country for your leadership. If you think about like how young Congressman John Lewis was when he was the activist, when he was speaking at the March on Washington, he's in his 20s. And so
Yeah.
you guys, you're never too young to be socially active. I gave a speech a few months ago out in Seattle, and a 13-year-old young man came to my speech, and it was at a business company for the workers there. And I was surprised to see a child in the audience. He was 13. And I said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I asked my dad if I could take off work to come and hear you because I want to get involved in the next presidential race. And I've written some position papers that I would like the Democratic nominee to adopt." And he sent them to me, and they were impressive. And so that's an example of a young person who said, it's important to me that I'm an activist and that I'm willing to miss a day of school because I'm trying to make a case for what I care about. And I want you all to feel that same sense of purpose and empowerment to recognize that our country, our democracy, will only be representative of your hopes and your dreams, your values and priorities, if you demand that it be. It doesn't happen by accident. In fact, quite the opposite. If you are not engaged, then I can trust me that the status quo will sink in. It is mighty. It is tough. And the only way people give up power, the only way people share power, the only way positive change happens, it creates a bigger more inclusive country is if those who have historically been left out and their allies demand it over and over and over again. Perfecting our union is not easy. It is not without sacrifice. And so I don't want to make you think that if you just do two things, it's going to suddenly like that change. It's not. But it's worth it. And so I encourage you to dig deep, find the energy, find the resolve, surround yourself with people who are rooting for you, because in this work you need support, and then get them involved too. They think that they're supporting you, but the next thing you know, you're giving them something to do.
Yes.
So I wanted to be with you today because I care so deeply about what you're trying to accomplish, and I want you to know how you have my support and my respect and admiration and appreciation. I have a grandson now, and the work that you do is going to make life better for my grandson. And so I thank you for everything you've done and also what you're going to do.